Ancient Egypt gave the world the pyramids, the Sphinx, and some of history's most stunning gold treasures. But almost none of that gold came easy. One job, deep in the desert mountains, was so brutal that ancient writers described it as a punishment worse than death itself. This wasn't pyramid construction. Pyramid builders, contrary to popular belief, were often paid laborers with bread, beer, and medical care. Archaeologists have even found their burial sites near the pyramids, treated with a level of respect that contradicts the old slave labor myth entirely. This job was something else entirely, and it happened far from the Nile, in the scorching mountains of Egypt's eastern desert in Nubia, a landscape almost nobody associates with ancient Egyptian history at all. Gold mining. Not the romantic version you might picture, with prospectors panning peacefully in a river. This was forced labor in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and the ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote about it in horrifying detail after visiting the region himself around 2,000 years ago. According to his account, the workers weren't miners by choice. They were convicted criminals, prisoners of war, and entire families, including women and children. Sentenced to the mines, sometimes for crimes as minor as speaking against the king or simply being related to someone who had. Once sentenced, there was no release date and no appeal process. Diodorus wrote that workers were kept in chains and forced to labor until they died, with no hope of ever leaving the mountains they'd been sent to, regardless of how minor their original offense had been. The work itself was almost unimaginable. Using nothing but fire and iron tools, workers had to crack solid rock apart by hand, heating it with flames until the stone cracked from thermal shock, then breaking it further with picks and hammers in choking heat and dust that filled the narrow tunnels. There was no ventilation in these tunnels. No safety equipment. No brakes built into the system. Just relentless labor, deep underground, in heat that could reach unbearable levels even before factoring in the physical exertion of breaking rock all day, every day, without rest. Once the ore was extracted, it still had to be crushed down to a fine powder by hand, using stone grinding tools, before the gold could even begin to be separated out, an entirely separate brutal, repetitive task assigned to different groups of forced laborers who never saw the mining tunnels at all. Diodorus specifically noted that young boys were often used to carry the crushed ore, since their smaller bodies could move through the narrow mining tunnels more easily than adult workers could. A detail that makes clear just how young some of these forced laborers actually were. Older men and women were assigned to the grinding stage, pounding ore into powder for hours without rest, guarded constantly to prevent any chance of escape or rebellion, working in shifts that Diodorus described as continuing for as long as daylight allowed, and sometimes beyond. And escape truly wasn't an option. These mines were deliberately placed in remote, waterless desert regions, surrounded by nothing but scorching sand and rock for days in every direction. Even if a worker somehow slipped past the guards, the desert itself would kill them within days, a form of natural imprisonment more effective than any wall. So how did anyone survive this at all? The uncomfortable answer is, many didn't. Ancient accounts describe extremely high death rates from exhaustion, heat, malnutrition, and injury, with the system built to simply replace workers who died rather than improve conditions for the ones still alive. The Egyptian state had an almost endless supply of new prisoners and conquered peoples to send to the mines, which meant there was little practical incentive to keep any individual worker alive longer than necessary to extract a useful amount of gold from them. But some survival strategies did exist, passed down through the brutal experience of those forced to endure it. Workers who understood exactly how much water their bodies needed, and when, had a better chance of surviving the relentless desert heat than those who didn't ration carefully. Guards did provide minimal rations, just enough food and water to keep workers productive, since a completely dead workforce produced no gold at all. It was a cruel calculation, but it meant survival was technically possible, if barely, for those who learned to navigate the system's narrow margins. Working in the coolest hours when possible, and understanding which rock formations were more prone to dangerous collapse, made a measurable difference in whether a miner lived through a shift or didn't. Experience, brutally earned through watching others fail, became its own form of protection. Social bonds mattered too. Historical accounts from similar forced labor systems throughout history suggest that workers who formed tight groups, sharing food, warning each other of danger, covering for the injured when guards weren't looking, survived at meaningfully higher rates than those left isolated and alone. Some workers likely developed informal knowledge systems too, passing down which sections of tunnel were more stable, which guards were more lenient at certain hours, and which small acts of resistance could be gotten away with without triggering brutal punishment. This wasn't unique to Egypt, either. Similar brutal mining operations existed across the ancient world, from Roman silver mines in Spain worked by condemned criminals, to later colonial mining operations in the Americas, all sharing the same grim pattern of forced labor, harsh environments, and workers who died simply being replaced by the next available body. What makes Egypt's gold mines particularly well documented is that Diodorus wrote about them specifically because he was horrified by what he witnessed firsthand. His account wasn't propaganda glorifying Egypt's wealth, it reads closer to an early form of investigative reporting on human suffering, written by someone who clearly couldn't look away from what he'd seen. He described watching workers so exhausted and malnourished that they could barely stand, still forced to continue working under the threat of the whip, with absolutely no regard for their survival beyond extracting as much gold as possible before they inevitably died. And that gold funded an empire. The temples, the treasures, the luxury associated with ancient Egyptian pharaohs, the golden burial mask of Tutankhamun, the temple decorations, the royal jewelry, much of it was built on wealth extracted through exactly this kind of brutal, invisible labor, hidden away in mountains far from the glamorous cities on the Nile. It's a pattern that repeats disturbingly often throughout human history. Visible wealth and glory sitting directly on top of invisible, brutal suffering that rarely makes it into the history books people actually read, or the museum placards people actually stop to look at. Modern mining, thankfully, looks nothing like this anymore in most of the world. Safety regulations, ventilation systems, fair labor laws, and basic human rights protections exist specifically because of centuries of exactly this kind of exploitation, hard-won through generations of labor reform. But it's worth remembering that in some parts of the world today, forced and exploitative mining labor still exists in different forms. A sobering reminder that this isn't purely ancient history, even if the methods, locations, and materials involved have changed significantly since Diodorus's time. Somewhere in Egypt's eastern desert, the remains of these ancient mining operations still sit largely undisturbed. Tunnels dug entirely by hand, grinding stones worn smooth by countless hours of forced labor, silent evidence of one of history's most brutal jobs, waiting for anyone willing to remember what actually happened there. Archaeologists have surveyed some of these sites in modern times, finding workers' quarters, tools, and grinding stations that match Diodorus's ancient description almost exactly. Physical confirmation of an account that might otherwise sound too horrifying to be entirely believed. The gold from these mines didn't just fund pharaohs either. By the time Diodorus was writing, Egypt was under Ptolemaic rule, the Greek dynasty that took over after Alexander the Great's conquest, and they continued the same brutal mining system their predecessors had built, simply because it worked so effectively at generating wealth. Records suggest the mines operated for centuries under multiple different rulers and administrations, each one inheriting the same infrastructure of tunnels, guard posts, and forced labor camps, with remarkably little change to the underlying system despite the political power above it shifting entirely. Some historians estimate that the total gold extracted from Nubian and Eastern Desert mines over the centuries rivaled or exceeded gold production from many other ancient civilizations combined, a staggering amount of wealth built on a system almost nobody discusses when they picture ancient Egyptian glory. It's easy to admire ancient Egypt for its monuments and treasures. It's much harder, but arguably more important, to remember the workers whose suffering made so much of that wealth possible in the first place, people whose names history never bothered to record, and whose stories almost vanished entirely. If you found this as fascinating and unsettling as I did, subscribe. I break down the darkest, most surprising corners of history, one story at a time.